Now, why did Russia start this entire attack on the Ukraine? I'm not going to pretend to understand all of foreign policy here and to explain the NATO expansion and the buffer zone and all of this, or the ideology behind this. I'm going to talk about the economy, and we're going to look at data. We're going to look at how did the Russian economy do? How did the currency do? How did it develop since this entire mess with the Ukraine started? That's what we're going to look at, because then we can potentially understand why Putin felt so cornered, why he felt that he had to do something about the current situation of Russia. Because in the end, when the economy is flourishing, when everybody is getting wealthier, when there's no real pressures, then your policies, they can be relatively bad. It doesn't really matter. Everyone is having a good time anyways, right? That's, for example, the argument with China, right? When the population can get out of poverty, when it can afford a medium lifestyle, then maybe they don't really necessarily want to fight for freedom. Maybe that's not that important. But this is a luxury that Russia really didn't have in the last 10 to 15 years. And that's potentially the reason why Putin felt the need to take on some risk, to risk conflict, to potentially gain more power, maybe gain more wealth, gain more security, gain more influence over the entire world. That's in the end the reason why you start a conflict, right? You want to push through your interest on the expense of somebody else's interests. That's the very abstract way to look at this. And so in this video, we are not going to talk about anything political. We are only going to talk about data, about objective measures that you probably haven't seen yet before. So we start off with a very simple chart, but we will go on with more refined chart in the course of this video. So first of all, here we've got the Russian index, right? Denominated in ruble. And of course, over here, we can see that this recent crisis didn't do too much good for the index, right? This is a drop since the 16th of February of currently 32%, in its lowest 44% roughly. So that's the index. Let's also look at the currency. The Russian ruble doesn't look that different, right? The Russian ruble fell since the 16th of February by 29%. And so what's important to note here is that the stock market is denominated in ruble, right? These companies, they make profits in ruble. So in other words, when the ruble falls by 50%, if the overall healthiness of the underlying companies doesn't change, that would double the stock market index, right? But that's not what we see. So we've actually got a compounding effect. To really get the impact of this entire crisis on the valuation of Russian companies, we have to look at the index denominated in US dollars, right? The US dollar is pretty much the benchmark. This is what we should measure the index against. And so here we see that since the 16th of February, we've got a decline of 52%. So this is what Putin has done so far. It has halved the economy's value within a single week. And this might potentially put pressure on Putin, right? If this continues further, if this continues to decline further, a lot of people in Russia, they might have their money in Russian stocks, right? Especially the very rich ones. All those oligarchs, they now suddenly have only half of their wealth. And they probably don't want this to continue further, right? And lose more and more wealth. And so maybe Putin doesn't really care what the fate of those young soldiers is. Who knows? But he's very likely going to care what his buddies, his other rich buddies around him will say. And when they see that they are getting massively poorer by the day, this could potentially have an impact, right? Just some food for thought. I obviously don't have a crystal ball either. I don't pretend to know what's going on in Putin's brain. Now, why did this here all start? In order to understand this, we have to look at the long-term development. So this is the Russian stock market index since 1997 all the way to today. And this looks fine, right? This looks like any other stock market. You just have to hold on for long enough. And if you're just willing to hold on for quite a while, you will make gains. And of course, this recent crash over here isn't great. But if you simply invest for long enough, you would still be in the positives. But this is, again, the index measured in ruble. And so when you want to buy an iPhone, for example, or anything else that's of value that's outside of your country, you have to look at the index measured in US dollars. And this looks way worse, right? This looks like zero progress in the last 17 years, roughly. So measured in US dollars, all you got from investing into Russian companies was sideways movement. You didn't make any money. But that might actually not be the biggest of the problems. The biggest of the problems is relative performance to the US, because that's probably where Putin sees the real competition. Putin wants to show that the US is inferior. It wants to see Russia becoming more and more dominant as a player on the world stage. And so when we now look at the Russian index denominated in US dollars divided by the S&P 500. So this is now the relative performance of Russia's index to America. This is what we are seeing. And of course, again, an impact here from the recent crisis, but this is a very long-term chart. And what we saw here from September 1998 to May 2008, so 10 years of prosperity for Russia, we saw an outperformance of almost 50x versus America. But that then quickly changed. Since that peak before this conflict here started, we saw an underperformance of 80% versus America. And this underperformance was pretty consistent, right? And that's probably one of the reasons why Putin might feel somewhat cornered. He still sees Russia as the major superpower. He still wants Russia to be at least head-to-head to the US. But in the last 13 years, roughly, Russia underperformed the US by 80%. And this is now based on the same currency, so this is real purchasing power. And so I can't really imagine what this means for the people in Russia, but maybe Putin faced things such as hostile M&A transactions, right? I don't know how much Russia is protected against this, right? But maybe he saw American companies buying Russian companies because now, just within a few years, they are suddenly only 1/5 of the cost, relatively speaking. So maybe he simply saw within his country this slow takeover of foreign influence into the Russian culture, into Russian ownership. And so with this negative momentum, with this continued decline of Russia's wealth, people start to ask questions, right? People start to ask if Putin is really the right person leading the country. And when you're in such a situation and you still have this reference point of outperforming the US that massively just 20 years ago, then maybe you are willing to do whatever it takes to bring Russia back. But this gamble seems to this time not have worked out well at all. If you compare this to February of 2014, so this was the Crimea crisis, let's get into this. This is what we are looking at. This is again still relative performance. It doesn't look as bad, right? It's a 10% decline, a 15% decline, which very quickly afterwards recovered again. So Crimea was really not a big deal. This is very different to what's currently happening. Almost no change over here, but an existential crisis over here. And so that's the problem with momentum and with reference points, right? When you are used to outperforming, you want to see this continue, even though over the very grand scheme of things, you actually didn't underperform the US by that much. So this is now, before all of this mess started, Russia was quote unquote only underperforming the US by 36%. Not that bad. But with this recent gamble, with this recent attack, we are now looking at an underperformance of 71%. So a complete destruction of what the people of Russia have built in terms of wealth. Now, of course, I have to do a lot of disclaimers over here. There's way more important things than money. When there's actually tanks rolling down the streets, when there's actually young people killing each other. So this is by no means an attempt to explain the entire situation. But I think it's good as an additional data point. When you're considering what's going on, why would Putin out of the blue suddenly start something like this? The continued relative decline of Russia might be one reason. And that might be another argument for having regularly rotating politicians, right? Regularly rotating leaders of power. Because when you change them every 4 years or so, you don't have that reference point of outperforming another country by that much. Maybe this decline here doesn't feel that bad because you're really comparing yourself just to the recent past, not to whatever might have been perceived as the glory early days. So there's a lot of arguments for limiting power, for keeping checks and balances, for splitting power, so between lawmaking, jurisprudence, law enforcement. All of these ideas, they might help protect the population from actions that lead to bad outcomes for everyone. So it's very clear over here that Russia did not gain anything from starting this attack. I know the content of this video might potentially be somewhat controversial. In case you want to open up a discussion, feel free to leave a comment down below. And if you haven't yet, feel free to subscribe as well. I mainly publish crypto-related content, but if this video gets some traction, I might continue doing more analysis on traditional markets as well. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye-bye.